with this in mind, please give a warm hand to Arne.
Obrigado, Vitali. So falo pouco de português, por isso prefiro falar in English. I hope that's okay. So, as Vitali said, I want to talk to you about clarity in collaboration. And that is because today I'm really glad that I'm not speaking at a product management conference, as I usually do, but that I'm speaking to a mixed audience of designers, developers, and product people, because I think collaboration only works if we all get together and do it together. So in the next half an hour, I want to share with you my experiences around collaboration, my take on the topic, and hopefully also give you some ideas how you can improve the clarity in the collaborations you are having at work. And since I believe most of you work in some sort of cross-functional setup, I hope that the following examples that I picked up in my work in the last few years also resonate with you, and you maybe have similar experiences. So let's go back in time a little bit. So here we have the situation. We decided to reuse that teaser format with a big image and the round button for the new screen you're working on. Thanks for the info. I'll implement it tomorrow. The night goes by. Hey, done. It's implemented now. Thanks. But I didn't mean that teaser. I meant the other one. Sounds familiar? Good. Let's look at the next case. So, hey, what's bothering you? Well, I just found out that the data science team will not provide the API calls we depend on to go live with our big initiative next week. What? Did they just not build them? No, in fact, they even worked overtime to get them done. But it seems they understood the context differently. And now what they built is completely useless. But did you not talk to them earlier? Sure, we talked many times. And when I last met Thiago at the coffee machine, it seemed that we were all on the same page. Apparently they weren't. Next example here. It is always the same. My PO Branca can't write proper tickets. What do you mean? She only always specifies the happy path, but I would also want her to include the edge cases. Have you ever told her that? No, not really. You know, she's new, and I didn't really want to put our personal relationship at risk. And last example here. Hey, we want to include our new section in the app's main navigation. Can you help? No, to be honest, that doesn't make sense. It's too narrow a use case to be included so prominently. But we need the prominent placement to meet our goals. I understand, but from a holistic perspective as a platform team, it still doesn't make sense. Where's it coming? Come on, can you not just make an exception for us? It's really, really important for us in order to meet our goals. Yeah, I would love to help, but if I make an exception for you, I also need to make an exception for others, and then the app gets more and more cluttered. This is complicated. Let's talk again next week, okay? Yeah, sure. Do you want a beer? Okay, so what all of these examples have in common is that a lack of clarity gets in the way of good collaboration. And these are all not super severe issues. But in all cases, they get in the way of getting the best product out to your users as fast as you can. And so they call delay, but they also cause waste, because people work on stuff that's then not being used, and that's a shame. And last but not least, because of that, the people working on those things will be unhappy and will not be satisfied with the work they're doing. So that's why it makes sense to think about the clarity we bring into our work. So what we've seen are cases of lack of clarity in the shape of misunderstandings, misalignment, missing role clarity, and unresolved conflicts. And those are the areas that I will tap into in this presentation. But before I do that, I want to share with you some general thoughts on clarity and collaboration. And the first one is, getting to clarity is work. And that's, I think, why we often avoid it and why we often are just too lazy to work on the clarity. But it bites us back. And so I really believe putting a little bit more effort in the beginning is really worth the extra mile, and it pays off in the end. And another thing that's important to remember about clarity and collaboration, like I sometimes hear colleagues say, oh yeah, I wish the management gave us more clarity. And sometimes that may indeed be needed, but it's important to distinguish two types of clarity. And one thing is called directional clarity. So that's basically what the management can provide. And it's a big topic in leadership literature right now, how leaders can give clearer guidance to people, because it's noticed by leaders that the more complex our environment gets, this is an important quality that leaders need to provide. But there's also a second type of clarity, and that's situational clarity. And when we talk about collaboration, we often are in situations where the leaders cannot help us. So the clarity we need needs to be brought into the situation by the people that are in the situation. So don't blame it on the leaders, but take responsibility yourself. And that's actually my main message for this presentation. Don't rely on others to give you clarity. It is your job, and everybody here can make your contribution to bring more clarity into your work environment, and you should. So now let's come back to our 4 stories. So what we had here in this example was that people assumed they understood each other. They assumed they were talking about the same teaser type, but they were using unclear terminology. And because of that, in the end, they caused waste, and they will also delay what they are working on. And that's a shame. Let's talk about assumption for a bit. Assumptions are one of the reasons why communication fails in collaboration. And it's very dangerous to assume that when you talk about something, that what you assume or what you understand is also what the other person understands. And there's this famous quote from the 70s, never assume, because when you do, you make an ass of you and me, which I would paraphrase as assumptions in collaboration can get everybody involved into trouble. And that's what we don't want to do. And I have a radical suggestion what you can do against that. It's okay to ask and to double check. So really, if you're not 100% clear that you understand what people talk about in a meeting, or if you're not 100% sure that there really is a decision, then just be brave enough to ask. It's no problem. Or also when you think, probably I understood it, but I'm not 100% sure, you could also double check by paraphrasing what you heard and so on. It's easy, but somehow we very rarely do it. And I think that is, for instance, because we don't want to seem stupid by asking, and maybe we think we should know it. And we are also afraid to double check, because that will, of course, mean a few extra minutes in the meeting. But if you don't do it, it will fall on your feet later on. And still, there may be situations when you get out of a meeting and you're not quite sure if, well, you came out with more clarity than when you entered the meeting. And if that's the case, again, a radical, well, actually not so radical suggestion, write a summary. It's easy. And of course, this takes a little bit of extra work, but it has several advantages. And I mean, this is just to say, if you're totally sure after the meeting that everything is clear, then you don't need to write a summary. It's fine. But whenever there's some uncertainty on your mind, should I write a summary or not? Do it. Because, first of all, it will help you to check if you're really clear on things. Because if you're not able to write a proper summary, you're not clear what was spoken about. So that's the first checkpoint. Second is, if you send it to the people that you spoke to, it gives them the opportunity to double check. And usually they will appreciate you being the one writing the summary. And last but not least, I mean, we have more and more distributed setups, and people work from different time zones and so on. So it's also, of course, practical to have a summary because you can share it easily afterwards. The second issue we saw in our little example is there was a problem around terminology. So terminology that led to misunderstandings. And there are 2 aspects that you can do to shape terminology in your organization. And one is to bake terminology into your tool chain, for instance, by using design systems. And when at XING we introduced design systems about 3 years ago, I was in charge of the native platforms for iOS and Android, and as such also responsible for the people working on the design systems for those platforms. And one thing that I always found super important is that the design system really facilitated or clarified the communication between the designers, but even more importantly, they also made the communication between designers and programmers more easy because we had corresponding components in Sketch and in code. And that way there's no guessing around the teaser with a big image and that kind of stuff. There is a name for it, and everybody knows if this is what is planned and I'm implementing it, that's, I'm not wasting anybody's time. So things like that, and I mean, design systems are just one example of how you can bake terminology in your toolchain. It's also a lot about naming of files, and there are many, many other ways. I'm sure you will can easily think of other examples. Second thing to keep in mind, and I would actually ask all of us to try to do that, let's not talk so much secret language, not so much designer talk, programmer talk, product people talk, or use terminology that's totally specific to your company or to your team. Because whenever you do that, you risk misunderstandings, or you're cutting people out who may not know what that is and then don't want to ask because they think they should know it. It gives them an awkward feeling and so on. And at XING, we also have a lot of beautiful acronyms. We have ATK, which people use to abbreviate Auftragsklärung. That's a framework I will talk about in a minute. Or we have a thing called WOMP. Does anybody, apart from my colleagues, want to guess what WOMP means? So to give you a hint, WOMP is one of the most important reasons of our company's success as a social network. So WOMP stands for sorry, if somebody raised their hand, it's totally dark there, so then that's why I didn't respond. So WOMP stands for visitors of my profile. And that's what more than 1 million premium members of our service pay for in order to see who was visiting their profile. And once you know that, it's easy and it's also quite memorable. But for instance, right now I'm onboarding a new product manager on my team. And he's confronted with all these acronyms, and I'm sure he doesn't know what they are. And I mean, he's a brave guy, so I think he will ask when he doesn't know it. Still, it's not good. So instead of trying to be cool with using lingo, try to make yourself understood, because that's actually much cooler, and you can benefit from it much more. So let's come to the second example, which is a case of misalignment. So what happened here is people collaborating found out far too late that they had different expectations of what was needed. So they were not clear about the why they were building something, of the context and so on. And because of that, they were also not clear what they were supposed to do. And they did talk, but they didn't talk about what matters. And as a result, they were not well aligned. And I believe that alignment is getting more and more important in times of complexity that we have for two reasons. First of all, if you're well aligned, it helps you to avoid waste, like we've just seen in the example. So the data science team worked overtime to get this call ready, and then nobody's going to use it because it's the wrong call. It's not what is needed. But secondly, also, alignment helps you to earn autonomy. And that's, I think we all want other people, we don't want other people to tell us how to do things, and there's also a lot about talk about autonomous teams and so on. And the tricky thing about autonomy is that you cannot just say, hey, give me more autonomy. You have to earn autonomy. Because only if those around you understand why you're doing something and what it is that you're going to be doing, then they will let you do things your way. So it's in your interest to seek alignment. And there are a few aspects that I find important about alignment. So first of all, you have to get the right people on board. And this may take some extra time, but it's worth it. Coming back to the earlier statement. It's important not just to chat, but to ask the tricky questions early, and I'll tell you in a bit which those could be. And it's also important to make sure that people not just sit in the meeting, but check their emails while you're trying to seek alignment with them, but really make them externalize what their thoughts are, really force them to actively participate and get out of themselves and share what's on their minds. So thinking about whom to align with, and this may not be exactly the same if you're in a very, very small organization, like we are 1,500 people, so this is coming from this type of perspective. So first of all, I think you need to align upwards with the management, so you need to know what the important stakeholders expect from the work you want to be doing, and you also need to make sure that they understand what it is that you want to do, so that they are not surprised afterwards. Very important, you need to align laterally with your peers, partners, other teams, like in this case it would have been the data science team. And last but certainly not least, you have to have alignment inside your team. You have to make sure that you're all pulling in the same direction as a team and that everybody knows why they're coming to work every day. How do you do that? And we came up with a framework. I mentioned the name before. framework by the beautiful German name of Auftragsklärung. I can tell you later over a beer why I like to stick to the German name of it, but the name is not so important. What's important is that this is a framework for bottom-up collaborative alignment. And as such, it is different from most other alignment frameworks that I know of, because usually they are about like, how can I, as a boss, get the rest of my organization to understand what I want and make them do it. That's typically what alignment frameworks want to do, and that's good. We also have top-down alignment, like we have annual goals, we have a vision, a mission, strategies, and all that kind of stuff, and those provide important guidance for us in our work. So I'm not saying anything against top-down alignment, but we believe we needed something else in addition, because to facilitate the collaboration, we also needed to put the people who actually collaborate in the driver's seat of seeking alignment. And as you can already guess from that picture, the way we choose to do that and to bring all the people on the same page is by a canvas. And that is not because we thought canvases were lacking in this world. I mean, there are already quite a few, but we still thought that a canvas could be beneficial in this case for two reasons. First of all, it makes sure that we tap into all those tricky questions like what are the boundaries, what must not happen as a side effect, and what are the main hypotheses that we carry. But also, of course, a canvas has this effect of forcing people to externalize their thoughts. So we do, usually in these alignment sessions, we get people together, we make them write sticky notes, and this really is a better discussion than if we were just talking over a PowerPoint or whatever format. So, and I don't have time today to go through all the different elements of Auftragsklärung. I just want to emphasize two. First is the question for intent, and we also heard the importance of intent in Jared's talk. So there's an author from the UK called Stephen Bungay who refers to the question for intent as the Spice Girls question. It's a question of what do you really, really want? And it's also always nice to use this picture in presentations, of course. And this seems like a very simple question, a very easy question. But when you remember the different angles of people that you need to align with, when you bring them together and you ask each of these persons, what do you really, really want from this initiative, you will find out it's not the same usually. And even if it at first may sound the same, when you look a bit deeper and you know, basically you have to ask that question a couple of times. And so through iteration, you can really sharpen it. And when you have it, you really have something that provides a really nice reference point for everybody in the coming collaboration. So that's why intent is really important. Second thing that really makes sense to talk about in a very early stage is outcome. So which needle do you want to move? And ideally, this needle should not be a broad lagging indicator such as user activity or member growth, because like at our company, for instance, there's probably 100 initiatives in parallel that aim to drive user activity. So if you do something, you change the product, and user activity goes up, how do you know if it was because of your team? How do you know if you're on the right track? So instead, you need a leading indicator that's much more specific, like say, for instance, of those users that open the app for the first time, how good is the conversion of those that then directly log in, or something like that. Like something that is closely related to what you want to change and what you're working on, so that you can then also really track if you're on the right track. And something that's also important here is not just to say, okay, what metric do you want to look at, but also what's your ambition level. And this may sound tricky because, as I said, Auftragsklärung is something we do at a very early stage, but at that stage there's still a lot of uncertainty. So like really saying how much can we move this needle feels difficult, but still, as product people or as everybody actually working on a product, we have something in our gut, and it makes sense to talk about that. And this may not, I may have the feeling, okay, we can improve this metric, we can double this metric. And another colleague of mine may have the impression that we can increase this metric by 20%. And both of it may not be true because it's based on a lot of uncertainty, but it's important that we talk about it and we actually say, well, if we can only shift this metric by 20%, is it actually worth all the effort we intend to do? So that's really something that is worth thinking about at a very, very early stage so that there are no disappointments later on. So here's an URL where you find more about this framework, and feel free to talk to me later at our booth. I can keep talking for a long time. What's important is, I've been promoting our framework a little bit here, but it's not about our framework or any other framework. What's important is that you have a dialogue with the right people early on and that you don't shy away from the tricky questions. With that, I'd like to come to the third example, which was around different expectations of a role. So in this case, the role expectations that team members had of the PO were not fulfilled. They wanted a different type of tickets. But there was a strong fear of damaging the relationship. And this is something that, I mean, I've been living in Portugal now for 10 months. I can say that the relationship layer is even more important here than it is in Germany. So I can imagine that this fear of how do I say this, how do I tell my colleague where I see difficulties is also something that maybe some of you struggle with at times. But the problem is, when you don't address these things, you miss the chance of improving. So you don't give Branka the chance to improve the way she writes tickets, or also as a team, you miss the chance of finding a different solution for it, which could be just that the QA adds the edge cases because the QA has a better understanding of edge cases. There are many solutions to tickets not being the way somebody expects. So the question is, how do you tackle this? And I think the most important thing to keep in mind here is that there's a difference between roles and the persons that have those roles. And this distinction is super important because what you have expectations of are the roles, not the persons. And when you do it that way, it's much more easy to be more open about your expectations of the role. It doesn't have to do with a person who have that role. Still, I mean, that sounds easier said than done. The question is, how can you support that? And for us, we've noticed that it really helps to frame it. And frame it in such a way. We do that, for instance, like if there's a conflict in a team, or sometimes we do it also when a team is just getting together with a lot of new members to make sure they exchange about the expectations that they have. And this was first brought to my attention, at least, by my first ever Scrum Master, Mel, from Barcelona. And she gave us 3 very simple questions, which then everybody on the team talks about. So what properties does your perfect product owner, in this case, display? And the advantage of talking about the perfect product owner in comparison to what do you expect of Branka is that it's clear, first of all, nobody's perfect. So it's clear that it just states your ambition, your dream, whatever. And it's also clear that you're not talking about Branka in particular. You're not criticizing what she's doing, but you're just stating what you expect of a product owner. And that's relatively, hopefully that's less difficult to say than, oh, Branka, I want you to do this or that differently. Second question is, what does he or she have to know about you so that he or she can work with you well? And this acknowledges that even though we're talking about our expectations of roles, those that have those expectations are still persons. And they have a history. For instance, in my case, like before I joined XING as a product person, I was working at a design agency for many years and also did a lot of UX work. And I think because of that, I will probably also have a different expectation of collaboration with UX people than some of my colleagues who come from a technology background have. So I, for instance, may want to be involved at an earlier stage because I have an opinion about design. So it's also helpful to state that. And the third question is, how can you support your product owner to do a brilliant job? And this points to the fact that for everybody to perform well in their team, it's also a matter of how they collaborate with each other and how they help each other out and so on. So this also, again, it's not something to just blame on others, but also you can contribute to making collaboration better in your team. Let's come to the last example. So here we have an issue around how to resolve a conflict between teams. Good thing is the conflict is approached face-to-face, but there are conflicting goals which those ladies cannot resolve. Like one is responsible for their, sub-products goals, and the other one is responsible for the overall platform appearance. And they will not find a way to get to a solution, which is in this case why they postpone it. And here what we saw is they avoid an escalation for reasons, of being nice to each other and so on. As a result, nothing happens. The whole initiative doesn't move on. They just say, we meet again next week, and in the meantime, we have a beer. That's nice, maybe, but that's not how it should be, I think. And here I've done a super scientific overview of when I think different types of communication should be used to resolve a conflict. So basically, what this says is that unless people really know and trust each other well, you should not use email to resolve a conflict. And even then, even if you know each other well, you can only do it if the conflict is not super complicated and not super serious. And I always wanted to use a dog video in my presentation, so I found this video recently who is trying to say the same thing. So this is it's a very short way of making that point. I like that. Another thing that we've seen, conflicting goals. And sometimes I hear colleagues talk, oh, shitty, we have those conflicting goals. Can we not get rid of conflicting goals? I think no, if you're in a part of a bigger organization, or even if you're part of a cross-functional team. Just between how a programmer looks at a problem and how a designer looks at a problem, you may also have conflicting goals. So it is just something that's part of our job, and we have to deal with it. We just have to do it well. And so what does that mean? Like if we say there will always be conflicting goals, it means we need ways of resolving them. And what I want to convince you of is to say that there is nothing wrong with escalation. And this is something, escalation has a very negative spin to it, but often when you seek alignment or want to come to a decision, it's the only way actually to move forward. And because we also found it very difficult to escalate, we even wrote a clarification manifesto. And initially it was called Escalation Manifesto, but then we thought, well, we are not doing escalation for the sake of escalation, we're doing escalation for the sake of clarification, so let's put that more in front. And this has 4 steps. So one is, if you notice that you will not be able to come to a decision and move forward, then trigger an escalation early. Don't postpone until the next week and have a beer meanwhile. Just do it. But of course, ideally, don't do it behind your colleague's back, but do it together. Agree that you don't agree, and then approach it. So for instance, a product manager on my team and a product manager on another team, they would agree that they don't agree and would come to me as well as my peer product director and confront us with a picture and ask for help. And ideally, they should not tell us for hours about all the things that they've discussed and all the problems, but they should spend time before and think about what it actually is that they want from us. What kind of guidance do they need from us? What is unclear? And then when we hopefully are able to help them by giving the right guidance, we as decision makers should hand it back. So we should not understand this as a call for micromanagement, but we should ideally hand it back to the people in charge, because that's where the rest should be handled. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. And I'm not a psychologist, as you can probably tell, and I'm still surprised by the many things that keep us away from clarity. But I hope that some of the examples I gave you made you more aware of the many types of unclarity we have in our day-to-day work. And I hope also I could give you some ideas for what to do, because again, the main thing is clarity is not somebody else's job, clarity is also your job. Thank you very much.